Now, there was heated debate in Clare County Council this week, with some councillors clashing over the government's and, in some instances, the Gardai's response to last week's fuel protests. Although all elected members unanimously supported an emergency motion seeking enhanced cost of living supports, there were divided opinions over the coalition's response to the oil shock, with Fine Gael Councillor Pat Burke coming out in favour of government efforts. Calls are also made for further cuts to green diesel and for more transparency surrounding prices charged at filling stations. Clare FM's Daragh Dolan was in attendance and first spoke with the Quilty Fianna Fáil councillor Michael Shannon.
This broadcast package on Clare FM is funded by the Local Democracy Reporting Scheme.
I'm calling for incentives, more incentives for farmers and agricultural contractors to get the effects of the elevated price of green diesel back in order to bring in the harvest this year. You know, we have very poor weather in Clare over the winter. The very late spring, even this week. You know, as we speak, we're waiting for the weather to clear to get some of the work done. You know, there's no slurry out yet in West Clare. Fertiliser isn't spread. And the fundamentals of, you know, farming, the agricultural sector from now on will have to pay elevated fuel prices. Rolls of plastic at the moment for bales are up a third in price already. So the inputs into farming at the moment is nearly 50% of what it was this time last year. And that's only going to increase the food price on the shelves later on this year. And that'll make everyone poorer in the county, and it's going to add to inflation. And that's why I tabled this motion 2 weeks ago before any protest was on, that the fundamentals in agriculture at the moment, because of the elevated oil, the fundamental charges, you know, the costs are gone through the roof, and it's making the agricultural contractors uneconomical. And for the farmers to pay it. The cattle have come back in the last month, and milk prices have stabilised, but they're low compared to what they were a few years ago. So, like the severe, I suppose, impacts of this war in Iran has been felt in the agricultural sector without a doubt. And I'm calling on the government to engage with the farmers. And after this last week, we need to ensure that there's an open line of engagement maintained with the farmers' unions and the government circles in order to ensure that the farming sector is supported from the government.
I think it is fair to say as well, there has been a heated debate here so far, and there is mixed opinions if you go to the public on whether these blockades were necessary. A lot of people are very angry with the, I suppose, vigilante element to this. A lot of people feel that the government brought the people to their knees and are very angry with that respect. But it is worth saying that the agricultural contractors who are out here protesting for greater supports, they don't get the bulk of their payments until the end of season from farmers. So they can be waiting a long time as it is. When the price of diesel goes up, if they're not willing to pass those costs on, they are going to be in greater debt, and that obviously kicks its way down the food chain in production. So is this something that should be sort of long go, or is there an avenue open to the government where they can subsidise agri-contractors who are waiting for those payments?
Yeah, I believe that there's where the dialogue should continue, because remember, you know, this happened last week because there was a lack of dialogue. There was a lack of understanding in the central government departments. You know, that there is a huge crisis here in the agricultural sector. And, you know, we need to ensure that this doesn't happen again. We need to ensure that the message coming from the farming bodies, the unions, ICMSA, the IFA, fishermen, all of the sectors, the cereal growers, they all have to be accommodated and heard and listened to. Because if the inputs in the farming sector is going up dramatically, it's going to increase pressure on those on contractors, on farmers, but it's ultimately going to add to inflation and food inflation in the shops. And we have dramatic food inflation since COVID, after COVID, and since the war in Ukraine, and now the war in Iran. There is massive inflation in food prices, and I know that everyone, women going shopping every weekend, they can see they're nearly paying double what they were paying 5 years ago in the trolley. I want to try and ensure that doesn't happen in this cycle, that we put in the inputs into the farming sector to try and keep down the price of food later on this year, to maintain a good relationship with the farming community. Because remember, we are trying to attract and retain young farmers to stay in our local communities and our local townlands, and this needs to be the farming unions need to ensure they're getting the message to the government departments that's applicable. So, what happened last week, started off with the contractors and local farmers, and then other groups came in and took over some of the protests in the certain areas, blocking the ports. I never agree with blocking the ports because you're holding up the whole country to ransom. They had made their point by Wednesday and Thursday this year, and we need to ensure it.
Kilmurray, Fianna Fáil Councillor and oil merchant Alan O'Callaghan. Alan, look, we had consternation at the fuel pumps. I believe it was 1/3 of the country stations ran dry, but you have an interesting perspective to provide on that. It wasn't necessarily, in your view, just blockades that led to this.
Absolutely, Daragh. And listen, it's the fuel at the minute is so volatile. It's an issue that we all know abroad in the Middle East. Is an issue with Iran. We know there's a huge problem out there trying to get fuel moved in and moved out. But I suppose just to give you kind of a few examples of that, I was in a job and I got held up and I was late going back to the port to reload, and it was actually closed when I was at the depot. When I got back the following day, it cost me €3,000 more to load the truck from the day before. So I suppose that's how volatile the prices are, and it's up and down, and it's shocking, and people are blaming the petrol station for price gouging, and it's not. It's just the way the market is so volatile at the minute, and your neighbour today might get the same amount of oil tomorrow €100 cheaper than you did. Do you know what I mean? And that's the way it is. And I suppose what happened was, you see, we were after a long weekend. We had Good Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and we bank holiday Monday, and the markets were showing that there was a considerable decrease coming midnight on Wednesday night. So what I can see, my perspective is that a lot of the petrol stations held off and probably used their stock down to a minimum over Tuesday and Wednesday, especially Wednesday, because the stock be down to a minimum. Now, when you have a price decrease coming that night, and I suppose to put it in layman terms, it was coming down, white diesel was coming down 22 cents. So 22 cents over a lorry load. If you were a petrol station was taking a lorry of 40,000 litres, that's €8,800 less you're going to pay on Thursday for your load as regards getting on the Wednesday. So I suppose what happened actually was that petrol stations were probably down to their minimum anyway, and then when the fear of the ports being closed Wednesday afternoon into Wednesday evening, I suppose people panicked as well and got to fill up their cars with petrol and diesel. Most of the stations they were probably running at a minimum anyway because of the price decrease, and I suppose that fuels the whole worry of fuel in petrol stations, and that's why a lot of them kind of decrease so quick.
Certainly, though, from the other perspective, and while I acknowledge what you're saying there about the markets and that about many petrol stations and forecourt owners would have hauled off and would have allowed their tanks to run to near a minimum after the bank holiday weekend, I suppose it also has to be acknowledged we haven't had a situation, in my living memory at least before, where the National Emergency Coordination Group has had to meet and encourage people not to buy fuel unless they need it and to try and prioritise it for emergency services. I mean, you'd be going back to the Gulf War of the 70s. So it certainly, I mean, it does have to be conclusive that the blockades at Foynes, at Galway, at Rosslare and at the refinery in Whitegate surely did impact the supply of fuel over this weekend as well.
Yeah, like you see, it's going to take a few days. It's going to take a good few days for it to catch up. And you see, unfortunately, some of these petrol stations may not have the volume. They may not have the tanks, the bigger tanks than the bigger petrol stations or the more newer petrol stations have. So it's carrying capacity for them, carrying stock for them could be an issue as well. But it is going to take a few days for it to catch up in stock, to get stock out to people. And it was from my own perspective, I was nervous enough that if we had ships outside sitting on the Atlantic ready to come in to the ports and weren't able to get the fuel off in a crisis where we were trying to get it from Iran and get it from all these other places, that we were now going to fuel, there were now going to be in a serious problem that, okay, the ports could open up, the ports mightn't have the fuel in to be able to distribute through the country. So that was kind of a worrying issue as well, especially with Whitegate and Cork, where there's a refinery there themselves as well, and they are refining fuel fine, but they were running close to capacity. And like you go back to when the COVID came, the price of the barrel became minus because when they were bringing up, they didn't know where to store it, because no one wanted fuel at the time. So the crude oil was just sitting there, and they were actually giving it to the refineries, paying the refineries to take it, because it's not like a tap that you can turn off Friday night and go home and come back Monday morning and turn the tap back on again. That's not where the oil business works. So that was a huge issue as well. Like.
And I think it is fair to say, though, that look, while opinion is divided on the blockades, even though they were illegal, and all the road blockades as well, certainly it has to be said that a blockade of an oil refinery was a step too far.
It probably was, yeah. But you can see, like, the government did wake up when they started moving in. They weren't taking these people seriously at the time, and I suppose it created maybe, we have now an issue, and maybe the government should have maybe forced that, but they didn't. And okay, that's fair enough. But like you're as you say, you're at a crisis at the minute, where I suppose like likes of Demblers and people like that need a fuel and get to work, and
certainly a lot of hysteria caused for innocent members of the public and elderly and vulnerable people as well, who rightly thought, oh God, we're not going to be able to get fuel and we have to rush down to the petrol station tonight. And we saw in Clare they were out, in Kilmehel they were out, and you had people driving miles out of their own towns and villages, and that's not fair in the media.
It's not fair, yeah. And even someone like, if you have an elderly person home and that's getting a bit of daycare, that people come in and help out around the place and stuff like that, and they kind of panicking whether they get fuel or not to get it in, so it was worrying. And down to the animal feed as well, there's like, and to the collection of milk was kind of a problem as well for some farmers. Their tanks were full for 3 or 4 days and they were trying to get milk out of there, and if you don't have the storage, their storage for holding the milk was at a max as well, and getting grain and stuff like that there. I know today that we said a lot of the grain people in Limerick and stuff like that, they're flat out getting stuff to support and trying, because you're milking cows now, and like there's people fattening cattle, and they can't go a few days without the grain, and the grain was a huge problem as well. But I suppose on the final note, I would say to people, just be careful of what you're seeing on social media, because it's not portraying what's real. There's a lot of,
there are certainly many AI doctored videos and audio transcripts at the weekend.
Yeah, and that's what I'd be kind of fearful of. People hone into that, and they think a lot of it, what happened did happen. That's fair enough, but just be careful of some of the stuff that you do see, and it's nowhere near the truth, or nowhere near reality, or what actually really happened around the whole country for the few days. So I just for people, just be careful of what you see on some of these, because AI now is so big. It can change people's faces, it can change pictures from day to night. So I just want people to be cognizant of that.
So I get Fine Gael Councillor Pat Burke. Pat, you're sharing your perspective on, I suppose, the week of madness that we had. It got very volatile at times. Ultimately, what came out of it, the government was forced into action, and we had that €505 million package announced on Sunday night. Now, while many in the council chamber here today feel that still doesn't go far enough, you're of a different view to the level of supports given by government to date.
Yeah, I suppose if we just go back to last week, as a farmer, I suppose on the Tuesday morning that the protest started, we said, okay, there's a crisis out there with the cost of fuel, and people weren't happy, so the protest took place. That was Tuesday morning. I ordered feed from Dan O'Connor Feeds in Limerick on Tuesday morning, as normal, never thinking there'd be an issue. And on Thursday morning, they contacted me to say I couldn't get the delivery of feed because the port at Fines was blocked. And that's when it really hit home. Jesus, this is getting serious now. When it hit at farm level and hit me personally, where you have a shed full of cattle and they're looking out wondering why they're not being fed. So that's what I spoke about today, that I didn't agree with the blockades, whatever about the protests, maybe up and down the motorway and a bit of that, holding people up for a while to get attention. But the blockades, and I think the Taoiseach last night, when he spoke about the blockade of the refinery in Whitegate, of all places, down in Cork, it beggared belief that we were preventing oil coming into the country in a time of crisis. So I have the same view, that protest okay, but not blockades.
With that said, do you think the government took appropriate action this week? Did they act in time? Because naturally, they were correct to say that the blockades were illegal, but did they act in time? Should there have been a more measured approach?
Well, my understanding is that the government were in talks. The day the Banner Plaza opened, councillors met with Oireachtas members, and the Oireachtas members told them, including our junior minister Timmy Dooley, that yes, they were listening to the people. They were having talks with the groups, the IFA, ICMSA, road hauliers, etc. So they weren't ignoring this problem at all. The protest then escalated it, I suppose, and brought it to a head. But they were working behind the scenes. They've delivered 500 million. On yesterday evening. That brings it up to a total of 750 million, quite a substantial amount of money. And I've no doubt, protest or no protest, the government will be continuing to review the fuel crisis. But as I said today, with President Trump, the way he behaves, it's so uncertain as to what the future holds in the Middle East that we could have another crisis next week or the week after if fuel jumps substantially again. So at the government, it's very hard to get a handle. It's impossible to get a handle on what's going on in the Middle East and the effect it's having all over the world. So our government have done reasonably well compared to other countries in Europe. They have delivered a good package, in my opinion, more than any other country across Europe. So it's a wait and see game now, and if more supports are needed, well then they'll have to be brought in as well. But we'll just have to take it day by day now and see how it goes.
Pat, you are a farmer yourself, and look, the views of the ICMSA and the IFA in recent weeks was that the original cut that had come in on excise for green diesel, I believe it was somewhere in the region of between 5 and 7 cent a litre, that was basically eroded for them, and that they really felt that while they were always in constant talks, they were just hearing this word engagement, and they were looking across at Spain, they were looking across at Poland, where both of those countries went against the EU, didn't wait for EU approval and slashed their excise. So is there a fair argument as well that we prioritised the EU's opinion above maybe the suffering of our own farmers and our own agri-contractors?
Yeah, we're being ruled by Europe, there's no doubt, and that was brought home to bear this weekend, where, like you rightly said, that we have to go along with what we're dictated to by Europe. But then when you speak to some contractors, like as I said inside at the meeting, when my contractor arrives to cut the silage, if his charges have gone up 10 or 15%, well sure, I have to pay him, that they'll have to pass it on to the farmers. The farmer will hope that he'll get it back in whatever farming he's doing or whatever. We can't expect, there's no point in me going to the government, my silage contractor wants more. We're already getting a bit of a help, as the general public are being helped out. And as a farmer, I suppose one of the measures yesterday was, my understanding is that if we send in what we purchased last year in tractor diesel for the calendar year 25, we can submit that, and there's 20 million included yesterday for that, and that's for contractors as well. So the government are, apart from abiding with Europe, of course, which annoys us a lot as farmers, it's tough going now to be in government with the crisis in the Middle East.
Clare Castle, Sinn Féin Councillor Tommy Guilfoyle. Tommy, but something that you did include in your mention, and Chantal gave mention to it as well, and I think it's important, is that the EU presidency is coming here, and you want Ireland to use its position whatever way it can to use diplomacy to call for a de-escalation or even a ceasefire to conflict in the Middle East, because as much as we do have a living crisis and those things rightly need to be tackled head on, what's really fueling this crisis is the conflict in the Middle East.
What's really fueling this crisis is a decision by Donald Trump, the President of America, and Benjamin Netanyahu, a fellow who is wanted all over the world for war crimes, to attack a sovereign nation by the name of Iran. That's what's caused this current fuel crisis. So that's right back at the start. Now we're facing a larger cost of living crisis in this country because of the actions of others, and of the actions of others you hope that your government can stand up and act on your behalf. And the general public in Ennis on Sunday morning felt that this government is not doing that.
This broadcast package on Clare FM is funded by the Local Democracy Reporting Scheme.